Thank you. Good morning, everybody from Vermont. It's about 8 a.m. here, but I know that there's people all over the world in different time zones. And so I was happy to be invited here. I am a philosopher and psychologist, and specifically a philosopher of education. And I'm going to speak today about this book that came out last year, or actually almost 2 years ago now, Education in a Time Between Worlds. And I'll probably speak for only about 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'm hoping to get some questions and things going. I've been thinking a lot about the way that basically screens have won and schools have lost. Is a basic idea here that we're in a situation where many of the things that were being attempted to fix large-scale public school systems have consistently been making them worse. And that has been happening in a situation where there's been an influx of, completely historically unprecedented technologies designed to be addictive and to capture your attention. And so you already had a situation, at least in the United States, where a pattern was unfolding. And this is a pattern that's been identified in the study of civilizational collapse by Joseph Tainter. The pattern is one where you get diminishing returns on investments in complexity. So let me explain what this means. What this means is that at the outset of building an infrastructure or a large-scale bureaucracy, you invest in making the thing more complex and you get huge returns. It's like, oh, let's build a big school where we can house all the kids, and then we'll make these schedules so they move around. And at first, the additional complexity gives you returns, right? But there's a threshold, and this has been studied, and this occurs basically in every civilization that has collapsed and been studied, that there's a threshold that's crossed when you continue to invest in increasing complexity, but you get diminishing returns on those investments because now the things become too complex. It's become too fragile. And so standardized testing, large scale, industrial strength, standardized testing as put forth across the United States public school system with No Child Left Behind and then Race to the Top. That's a perfect example of diminishing returns on investments in complexity. That in fact, the more money we threw at standardized testing, the worse the schools became. And so we were already in this situation of being in what's called like a self-terminating pattern of institutional decay within the large-scale bureaucratized public school systems. And so I think we're in a situation now where, as I tried to describe in my book, we're really very fundamentally between paradigms of education. And so that means that for the time being, we're in a crisis of intergenerational transmission, right? And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. So for the time being, we're in a situation where not a great deal of education is taking place. And that education which is taking place may not be what we want, which is to say the screens are winning, the schools are losing. The predominant modality of adolescent socialization has become what occurs on this screen, not what occurs in the cafeteria or the school bus or the classroom or the dance. I don't even know if they have dances anymore. And so this issue of how do we take a moment when there's been almost complete institutional disruption and utilize that kind of moment between worlds to make it so that when we recollapse into a world, right, when the wave function collapses again and we're reworlded and we come into like some normal form of institutional functioning again, whatever that would look like, that it's a demonstrable improvement over prior conditions and not a demonstrable regression into something that is worse, or a progression into a worse situation, which is easy to think about happening given the way things have been playing out. So you can get a sense that the theme of the book is basically to think about education in the context of near-term inevitable civilizational collapse. This is the idea. And that doesn't mean near-term inevitable species-level extinction. That's a different thing. That is a likely outcome of civilizational collapse. but it doesn't necessarily have to happen. When civilizations collapse, often they get rebooted, and they usually get rebooted from things occurring in the wilderness, on the peripheries, outside of the declared centers of power. So when you're in a time between worlds, you're in a position where the actual power over the future shifts from the center to the periphery. And it shifts from the powers, like the halls of power at the core of the self-terminating system, to the innovative barbarians in the wilderness, who end up picking up the best of what had occurred in the prior collapsing civilization and retooling it for some reboot. Now, this is what has occurred before, as demonstrated by Tainter and others who study civilizational collapse. We're in a slightly different situation because the civilization is planetary scale, which means that if it collapses, it's a way worse situation than just like having a, just Europe or something go down, right? Which is what happened, let's say, during the 30 Years' War, when we had a civilizational collapse and a reboot. But another moment here in those processes of institutional decay and then rebuilding a new form of civilization, there's a specific function for educators in particular in those moments. And so I've been doing a lot of research on a figure who should be more widely known in educational circles, this man, John Amos Comenius. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of Comenius. He's one of the most important educational thinkers who ever lived. And he was involved in the circuitous route between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in Western Europe, and the transition out of the feudal system and into the capitalist world system, and out of the divine right of kings and into the rule of democratic law. And he was seeing this specifically as an educational challenge, right? And he articulated a vision of an invisible college, which became a quite famous notion. The invisible college was a group of scholars and educators who were working to build behind the scenes the infrastructures, specifically the educational and academic infrastructures, that would form the seed of the new civilization that would emerge from the detritus, in this case, of the 30 Years' War, which was basically like the First World War. Excuse me, like the actual First World War, meaning that the entire capitalist world system, what would become the entire capitalist world system, was completely embroiled in violent conflict and propaganda. Yep, that's him in the chat. Good old John Amos Comenius. A lot to say on him, but the point here is he identified this pattern, which was later identified by researchers as civilizational collapse, that the only way through this process of self-defeating institutional decay and is basically like an educational play. It's like an educational venture, almost like an ark, right? Like Noah's Ark, where, okay, this thing's going down. We have to figure out a way to capture the most essential ideas that could be used to reboot the thing, get them in some kind of safe place and see them through the storm and then seed them. So Comenius's Invisible College would inspire what became the Royal Academy of Sciences, which was founded in 1660 something. That's seen to be the first institution of what we call the Enlightenment, at the beginning of a complete transformation of political and social organization across Europe. Comenius basically invented the modern school system and a whole bunch of other things like student-centric pedagogy and et cetera. That whole story is just about the primacy of educators and the primacy of educational thinking during times of rapid and dangerous societal transformation. So where it seems like the place to be when the chips are down and society is coming apart is like to be a politician or something, right? But this is actually incorrect. The politicians are captured by the collapse dynamics that are playing out. Their decision-making procedures have been basically hijacked by certain bureaucratic norms, which have been legally mandated so that they actually cannot make the right decision. So an example of this would be the legal requirement of public companies to return as much as possible to their investors, right? Overriding any other possible motive for doing their business. So that's a case where even if these guys in power wanted to make the right decision, they've been bound by the massive bureaucratic structures written into which are self-terminating patterns. So actually, like I said, in those halls of power is not the place where the future is being created. It's actually, everything's moved to the periphery and to the so-called wilderness. And in those places, you have the rescuing and resuscitation and protection of intergenerational transmission processes. This is the idea. So when you look at like the work like Habermas did in the 70s on the legitimation crisis, or Tainter's work or others, you understand that although we think education is this thing that happens in schools and that you do for a certain part of your life and then it's done. In fact, education is basically the autopoietic process of the social system itself, which is to say it's the way the society recreates itself and perpetuates itself and continues its own existence. So like, if you have a society that requires a certain number of nuclear engineers, you need an education system that can produce nuclear engineers. Otherwise, your society cannot reproduce the necessary social roles to maintain itself, right? So the more, and again, diminishing returns on investment and complexity. The more complex you build this social system to become, the more robust your education system needs to be to keep funneling people into these massively complex and nuanced positions of authority and responsibility, right? So this notion that we could reach a place where there's a catastrophic bifurcation in intergenerational transmission. We cannot systematically reproduce the capacities to fill the roles and the positions that need to be filled to just keep the thing running. And so this is happening in journalism, for example. And again, this comes to my work in the Consilience Project. When you look at the shifting tone and nature of journalism since, let's say, 2015, what you're getting is a generational changing of the guard where the younger generation has actually not been transmitted the principles and standards of professionalism that journalism was created around. That the fourth estate, the thing that allowed a democracy to work, the informed citizenry based on education, newspapers, et cetera, that the principles around the fourth estate have not been handed down to the next generation. So what we're calling journalism now is actually not journalism. It's actually something more like entertainment and propaganda. And so that's important to get that was a process of failure of intergenerational transmission. And an arrangement of incentive systems that basically allowed that to happen. So yeah, the crisis of intergenerational transmission is the way I've been characterizing the educational crisis, and the notion that we could have a capabilities crisis, which I just mentioned, like, okay, we need 600 nuclear engineers at least. And our higher education system so far can only produce about 50 or something. Like, so that's a capabilities crisis, right? An example, a whole bunch of government software, including the IRS in the United States, was built around a programming language that is basically ancient. And no young people know how to use this programming language. And all the older people who wrote the code are retiring. Right. So that's an example of a crisis of intergenerational transmission resulting in a capabilities crisis, which could be catastrophic. But there are other forms of failure of intergenerational transmission. You can have a legitimacy crisis. So here it's like, you've got the nuclear engineer, but he's like, nah, I don't really buy your ideology. Like, maybe I could go work for the state at the nuclear power plant, but I think the state's corrupt because I wasn't educated in such a way that allowed me to see justified reasons for the behavior of prior political actors, which is to say, in the schools and media and in other places, you can create a legitimation crisis where even if the capabilities are there, you can't motivate people to do the work. And then there are also meaning crises, right? And we've seen this, Vervaeke talks about this. Another way you can fail in intergenerational transmission is that you do not provide the resources for meaningful self-understanding to emerge as a part of identity formation. And so in that case, he could be perfectly capable. And he could kind of see why it's important to maintain the state, which is to say it's not exactly a legitimation crisis, but he can't answer the meaning about who he is, why his life is valuable. So now you have someone trained to be a nuclear physicist who's a nihilist because he never had any humanitarian training. He never had any philosophy or psychology or spirituality or anything like that. So now you have a meaning crisis. And then there's the intelligibility crisis, which is just, do we know what's going on in the world? So outside of can we fix the problems that need to be fixed, do we actually have a comprehensive understanding of our shared situation in the world? And is the elders' understanding, is that understanding of in its full complexity being passed down to younger generations? But now understand, if you're an older generation who has created a very complex and corrupt system, how can you actually tell the younger generation about the intricacies of the complexity and corruption that you have created? It's very difficult to do that. So to the extent to which the institutional decay becomes extreme, and you have elders in a situation where they cannot in good conscience actually reveal to the youth the true nature of the social system that they have created, then you end up passing on to them something that they actually do not understand. Why did this law get created? Why do we have these relationships between these biotech companies and the global South? How did these things come to be? Tell me, wise elder. To which the response is like, I don't want to answer that. I'm retired. You take over. And so this is the depth and complexity of the educational crisis beyond the self-terminating patterns of school reform and into the broader culture, the broader dynamics of intergenerational transmission, failure at that level. And so this is just to say that when I speak with educators and in my own work, so understand I started a nonprofit, a co-founded nonprofit in graduate school dedicated to large-scale standardized test reform. And the idea here was, okay, this was me 15 years ago, right? We're going to fix these huge schools. Like, there's a way to do this where we could build a standardized testing infrastructure that would be demonstrably more effective because it would be based on psychological science, and it would be non-invasive, it would be non-high stakes, it would be richly textured overviews of student performance. Like, we have the technology and it's still there. And so that was my play. Go knock on the front door. Hey guys, the unforced force of the better argument should have us change the standardized testing infrastructure, right? But to give you a sense of it, we were in Texas and working with like a Texas K-12 council. We were gonna swap out the No Child Left Behind test and swap in this much better standardized test. We're giving a talk, and a woman stands up on the K-12 council, and she represents real estate interests. And she says basically like, this is very exciting, but if you guys change the standardized tests, then real estate values in the Dallas-Fort Worth area will fluctuate unpredictably. And nobody wants that. And this is true, right? So same exact house, same exact property. The house is in this town, which has good test scores, $100,000, $200,000 more dollars than this town, which is bad test scores, right? So real estate values. And if you look at the largest cheating scandal that ever occurred in the United States, took place in Atlanta. And if you look at the nature of the Atlanta cheating scandal, it was from the superintendent down. And the superintendent was speaking to business leaders in Atlanta who were like, we got to find a way to attract people to Atlanta. We got to convince them that the schools are good here. And then we'll be able to hire like way more employees, because we'd be like, come to Atlanta, look at these schools, they're amazing. And so this is just to say that I do not think at this point trying to change the nature of the functioning of large-scale educational bureaucracies is the best use of serious educational reformers' time. I think these systems are dying. I think the pandemic is killing them. And so I think we need to think in a very serious way about working in the wilderness and on the perimeter and of innovating, not innovating in a way that makes everything go to scale, and then we create another version of a massive one-size-fits-all thing, innovating in a very specific pocket of locality on unique problems and solving those problems there. From these, you can extract general principles, which can be shared across those local initiatives, which I think is very important. But the kind of like education startup model where you like do something in one little place and then you sell it and then you create an educational chain of startup schools and it goes everywhere, and it's like, no, that's not how it's going to be. The way this thing's going to play out as the civilizational collapse unfolds, there's going to be such heterogeneity and such unique local context specificity as far as what's going to be possible educationally. It's going to be very difficult to be like, okay, this worked here, so it will work there, when you have no idea what's going on there. And that's going to be increasingly the case as the economic inequality stratifies, as the global supply chains get rearranged, as the sovereignty of nation states are questioned by large-scale biotech companies, as is what's happening now. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of complexity to be handled by educators. So we need to think about flexibility, improvisation, design patterns rather than commodities, and general first principles and first values to move from, as opposed to very specific recipes and blueprints and things of that nature. And then this notion of sharing, right? This notion of building spaces for open communication among educators, which are constructive. And so that means a concerted effort to capture and archive and curate the nature of those collaborative conversations. Because I noticed there's a lot of conversations happening between people, but I don't see a kind of like, and this is important, even just for like morale, like let's talk and share war stories and do these things. But there's a way that these could be captured and integrated and worked with that I haven't seen taken advantage of yet. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. And then I think once these things start to occur and it becomes very clear that the kind of mainstream large-scale educational reform efforts are causing more trouble or they're just failing, then I think we will start to see resource allocation changes as well. So the other factor here is capital, right? And the public education system in the US has been a hobby horse of philanthropists since the 1800s, like an ostensibly democratic school system for the people, by the people, has been affected by a few small philanthropic forces, specifically what Diane Radovich calls the Billionaire's Boy Club. And so there's tremendous amount of power and a lot of elbows being thrown in the domain of educational reform. I could see a small, if not reasonable sized subset of that same class being recruited to the wilderness. And again, this is what happens as the civilizational collapses. A lot of the power moves to the periphery, which means some of the capital and resources will move to the periphery. And so I think the more there's demonstrated proof of concepts in these mystery schools in the wilderness, the more they will attract the attention. And when that happens, it's going to be tempting to lose integrity and try to scale a giant educational chain with an ambitious, wealthy patron. But in fact, the goal needs to be different than that, and stay local, unique, and bespoke to the challenges of a particular area. So that's some of what I speak to in the book. I talk about a distributed educational hub network model, and I talk about a series of related social miracles, which are broad social policies that could be implemented that would have a tremendous educational benefit. This includes global debt jubilee, and something like a basic income guarantee. And the global debt jubilee, when I wrote it, it was like, yeah, all right, kid, like whatever. Like, and now people are seriously talking about a global debt jubilee, in part because of the economic situation that has resulted from the pandemic. And again, when you, I keep harping on this, but if you look at the situation Pfizer put South American countries in, demanding their sovereign assets as collaterals for loan taken out on vaccines, then you start to see that there's a tremendous complexity happening at the international level in terms of just like, there is undoubtedly a new world emerging. And I'm saying that educators, even though it seems like they're on the periphery, I'm saying the periphery is exactly where you want to be right now, because that's actually this place of hidden power, although it's also an uncomfortable place, and a place, a very precarious place. And so, yeah, so that's me also saying thank you all for being educators when you could have been bankers or CEOs or something. You know what I mean? So like, it's gonna get harder, but it's also gonna get more exciting. And when there's a complex dynamical system in a state of perturbation, this is where that whole notion of the butterfly effect comes in. Sorry to like end on a cheesy note. But if you have a system that's running really well, really solidified, and you try to make it move, it's just not gonna move. But if you have a complex dynamical system that's in a lot of state of flux, and you put one little move in, you can have massive ramifications. And so that's actually the situation we're in now, for better and for worse, because everyone's aware of that. They're like, oh, now's the time to make the move, says the rich guy, right? But, oh, now's the time to make the move, says the educator as well. So this is the time. Like this, we're going to reach a point where for whatever reason, the buses just won't bring the kids to school, and the kids will all be left in basically their local spot. I predicted it would be like ecological, like superstorm prevalency or something like that. I didn't think it was the pandemic. And I said, in these situations, and it's funny, I actually approached some school systems in Vermont about this, where it's like, I was saying, get ahead of this and build something like a generator for your educational system where, okay, the grid goes down and you can't get the kids in school, and you can flip the switch and you can boot an alternative digital infrastructure. And no one was interested in that. I was saying, because there were going to be more superstorms. I didn't know that there would be a global pandemic. Of course, if I had said because there's going to be a global pandemic, they would have called me a conspiracy theorist, but here we are. So, but the idea with the Educational Hub Network is, yeah, we can basically create local, and they're calling them pods now, but my vision was actually more the size of a neighborhood. So the idea for the Education Hub Network is to literally refashion and redesign the school buildings themselves into things that are more like co-working centers, computer labs, and daycare, and a library and a museum combined. So the idea would be, there's a community center, which may be an old school, but there's definitely a place where people can go. So the vision is not one of children isolated alone in front of their screens. That is a nightmare scenario, which I also lay out in the book as one of the dystopian educational futures that we need to provide, where each kid sits alone in front of the screen and is given state-mandated curriculum that is basically, like that's a very dystopian scenario. And so, no, this is a vision where there's a technological backend that's extremely sophisticated. So it's a vision where you couldn't do the Educational Hub Network without the digital, because it provides the cosmo-local, I like that word, connection. But you also can't do the Education Hub Network alone. The whole point is that it is a time and skill sharing network on the back end, so that all of the members of the community, including the parents, who have been alleviated from a lot of their labor by both debt jubilees and standardized income guarantees to become more involved in their children's lives, so that everyone registers their skills, and everyone registers their interests, and everyone registers their time. And you have created a time and skill sharing network, which basically creates potential pop-up classrooms, right? So it's like if you imagine a neighborhood and everyone's walking down the street, and it's like people are passing one another, not even knowing that, like, that dude knows piano and I want to learn piano. Or like, that dude knows African-American history and I want to learn African-American history, right? So it's like there's all of these potential educational relationships within the community. What the digital infrastructure of the Educational Hub Network does is makes those implicit educational relationships explicit, and then allows people to potentially get into innumerable numbers of educational relationships within their community, not just teacher-student relationships formalized by the bureaucratic public school, but a whole broad array of community educational opportunities. That back end within that neighborhood is linked to the back end in all the other neighborhoods, right? So in Kansas, we're not just having people teach creationism, right? That we're actually infusing a universal basis of standards into the back end while allowing customized, unique, neighborhood-specific pop-up classrooms and educational configurations to emerge within those. So again, you couldn't really have done this, although Illich laid out something very similar in the 70s. It would be very difficult to do it without the digital. And this is part of my argument, that we don't understand what the affordances of digital are for education. We think it's just the screen and like Khan Academy and YouTube and stuff, but that's actually old school. That's broadcast. That's just a new version of TV with way more channels. We know that that doesn't work educationally. The digital allows for the type of thing I was describing: broadly distributed, interconnected networking with large scale memory and instantaneous connection and two-way dialogical relationship, as opposed to one-way broadcast relationship. So I believe there's a whole new class of educational technologies waiting to emerge.
So Zach, do you know of any of these networks that have actually started up?
So there are a couple, and if you email me, I can share, because I don't have permission to speak about them. Some of them are quite basic in the sense that they're just parents who've organized in the context of the pandemic. But then prior to the pandemic, there were groups, mostly coming out of like the homeschooling or unschooling communities, which were building versions of this. And a couple of those folks have reached out to me. So, but again, for as long as the large scale, huge bureaucratic public schools are seen as kind of the thing that we need to be investing in and fixing, these experiments will continue to be marginal experiments. So it's going to be that shift as a result of the pandemic, realizing the futility of those ways of thinking about schooling, that will start to shift attention on these experiments, and then they will grow.
I'm a teacher in a secondary school, and I just wondered what your thoughts are about, if you are in mainstream, do you think there's any hope for that? I just wondered what your thoughts were about working and being in mainstream education.
I mean, we need all the help we can get in all the places where the youth are in touch with adults. So I guess what I'm saying is like, please stay and help children. What concerns me are those people who are either leaving another career or beginning a career with the intention of going in and fixing that system at a meta level. So I love people who want to go in and be teachers and just be there and be present and help children. And they know they're going into like the trenches in a foxhole, and many of the cards are stacked against them, and it will be hard for them to help children, but they do it anyway. Like, that's great. My concern is with strategic and policy and technologists who are coming to address the problem. That's basically what I'm talking about. So mostly with teachers, I kind of want to, give them a pep talk and resources and other things to help them help children who have no choice but to be part of the system. Like many children who are put up and into educational contexts, they have no choice at all. And so that's me saying, yes, please, for those in the system, especially with power in the system, do what you can to protect the children in it now. But for people who are looking to kind of like get into education, like make a big splash or something, I see a lot of tech guys and finance guys who've solved problems in business now think because they solve problems in business, they can solve problems in education without ever studying education or psychology. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. So please, more power to you. And yeah, it's not working. Like, we just can't run schools the way we've been running them during the pandemic. It's just simply not working. In the United States, the educational inequalities have been so drastically exacerbated, as has the economic inequality. A few things. Yeah, I didn't mention kind of curriculum studies at all in when I was speaking. In the book, I do address it. Like, there's two issues. There's the form and the structure and the infrastructure of education. And then there's the, as you're saying, the content of what we're actually teaching. And so I make recommendations for a very different way of thinking about curricular design, and specifically raising the idea that for the most part, we've had an extremely truncated set of things that we've taken seriously. And the movement towards a fundamentally different way of conceiving of the nature of knowledge, and specifically the integration of different forms of knowledge beyond scientific knowledge, including socio-political knowledge, and also what would be classed as forms of religiosity and spirituality as needed content, are part of what I write about in the book. So this is true. There's a major component of educational reform that has to do with rethinking the actual content that's transmitted. But I'm a very much think like McLuhan and say, well, the medium is the message. So even if we try to bring new innovative curricular content through the old channels of distribution, it will fail. So at the same time we bring new form and structure, we need to bring the new content. So I'm completely with you. And then to your other point, yeah, completely. I had mentioned Joseph Tainter's models of civilizational collapse. And he mostly looks at civilizations, non-Western civilizations that collapsed. South America, Mesopotamia, regions in Africa, regions in Asia. And so while it is the case that the civilization we live in is the result of this complex, multi-century long project of the capitalist world system, it's very clear that when you look at the history of civilizations, which include non-Western civilizations, they all collapsed. And many of them collapsed as a result of exhausting their ecological resources. Many of them collapsed as a result of getting into violent, catastrophic conflict. And so it's not the case that the West is uniquely good at building self-terminating civilizations. There's never been a civilization that didn't self-terminate. When you look at the anthropological evidence of those, let's say, I don't know what to call them, groups of people who never decided to go the route of civilization, like the indigenous peoples in North America. What's interesting there is that there had been in the Mississippi River Valley, a Mississippian civilizational epoch, and Tainter studies this, a large civilization of indigenous North Americans, which had a catastrophic collapse. And there's a belief that the Native Americans who were there when Columbus arrived or whatever were the diasporatic results of the collapsed Mississippian civilizational epoch, and that they actually agreed not to create a civilization again because of what went wrong. And this is speculation. There's not a lot of archaeological evidence for that last fact, but there is a lot of archaeological evidence that there was a Mississippian civilization which did collapse by exhausting its ecological resources. So I think it is not completely accurate to paint a picture that says the ancient older cultures were better than the modern Western cultures. I don't think that is correct. When you look at the forms of warfare and human sacrifice practiced. So it's a complex conversation. And again, the civilizational collapse literature and research has focused a lot on non-Western civilizations and the dynamics of their collapse. And many of them had ontologies very different from the ontology that the West has, and still ended up creating a self-terminating civilization. So we're looking at very, very, very deep patterns in human behavior, probably even deeper than those patterns created in the wake of the Enlightenment. And that the transformation we're looking at now on a planetary scale is more akin to the move, it's a much more significant change in humanity than almost anything we've seen before. And that's why it's such a precarious moment, because we don't know what to do. There's not like some other culture or some older culture or some foreign culture that we can look to that has the answers. This is just not the case. And we're in it together. And so I think there's a great deal of work to be done in the content of our education, as you're saying, to show the full complexity of our sociocultural situation. That's at least half the work, if not more of the work that needs to be done. The book is a collection of essays, and one of the essays is specifically about the dynamics of teacherly authority in the context of religion and spirituality. And this gets to your point. So at the seat of a lot of our problems is a kind of widespread subclinical psychopathology, subtly nudging people towards sociopathy and narcissism, and disenchantment of the world and a desacralization of everything. And so this question of how to create spaces between us where things like the truth or, fairness are held sacred, not as political weapons in this strategic conversation I'm having with you, where I make a moral claim or a truth claim. I kind of believe it, but mostly I'm making it because it's useful right now in the context of this strategic exchange, but actually earnestly collaborating to reach mutual understanding. So to really know your teacher, you hide under his bed to see how he ties his shoes, right? And the idea there is that you learn from your teachers, not just what they say. They transmit their whole being to you, which means that the teachers themselves need to become moral, ethical, spiritually, intellectually inspiring, right? And again, the seat of legitimate teacherly authority is that. It's the perceptible feeling tone of the teacher that brings the student into a relationship of basically of love, right? But illegitimate teacherly authority is just mandated bureaucratically. Why do I listen to you? Because I'm told to by the institution, right? Now, I wrote a lot about psychopharmacology in the context of schools. My second chapter of the book is specifically about that, ADD, ADHD medications, and the medicalization of academic underperformance. And the medicalization of deviant behavior is also the depoliticization of deviant behavior, right? Because if you medicalize academic underperformance, then you stop all questioning of academic context, blaming entirely the physical nervous system of the child. So it's completely depotentiate the political argument that the child's being treated unjustly and unfairly.